reflections on COP27. Delighted to see many known familiar faces. Sir Christopher, welcome. Good to see you. He's a long-time supporter of GYLC and our climate work. Good to see you. GYLC's board member, Ellen Goldstein. Ellen, welcome. Good to see you. A lot of our former colleagues, Sabbir and others, good to see you. Uh, Several of our climate champions have also joined from different places. When I was looking at the background of people who've signed up for this, we have people from academia, university students, young people, so very diverse background represented in this room. So, so my comments today will be quite introductory in terms of COP27, what is it, what it is, where we are in my assessment of the state of the planet that I sort of understood from my conversations with different climate scientists, and some of my reflections on where we are and where we need to go, the kind of leadership that would be required in the world. So the agenda for today is, and you can all hear me clearly, right? Okay. So the agenda for today's conversation is the current state of the climate crisis and COP27, the kind of leadership challenges we face in times of crisis, and how we can engage young people to tackle the climate crisis. So if you look at the agenda, the word crisis comes at least thrice in the agenda. So I thought I'd first make a few comments on what a crisis is and what are some of the characteristics of a crisis. So in any crisis, think about a medical emergency. A patient has had a heart attack at 4 o'clock in the morning. That's like, a crisis that some of us can relate to. Uh, someone in our family went through this. So in a crisis like that, the outcomes are uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. The stakes are very high, and there is time compression. There is pressure to act quickly. In any crisis, we have to take quick decisions. So in a medical emergency, if it's at 4 in the morning, the doctor has to decide, okay, do I operate on this patient? First is how do I stabilize the patient? And then do I operate a bypass surgery, or what is the next course of treatment in time of a crisis? Why it's important? Because often when we talk about the climate crisis, at least for me, I grew up in Bangladesh, and when I was growing up in Bangladesh, I grew up hearing Bangladesh is going to be flooded one day. All right. So this is when I was 10 years old, and now I'm 41 years old, and our country is still there. So this crisis, it's difficult sometimes to understand because this crisis is not happening in 1 year, in 1 month. This is taking a longer period of time. So that's why sometimes when we talk about climate action and climate crisis, the action is not happening at the speed it needs to happen because how people are experiencing the urgency of this crisis. But if I look at a bigger time scale, then this crisis really uh, is is a very short span of time. Although we are experiencing in a long time, but in the bigger scheme of things, the time scale is not that big because the Earth is around 4.5 billion years old, as we know. Life can be traced back to 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. And already we have had 5 mass extinction events. The last one was about 65 million years ago when dinosaurs became extinct. And one thing that needs to be noted about these mass extinction events is 100% of the species don't go extinct. Between 35 to 75% of the species went extinct in the previous mass extinctions. And right now, many scientists are talking about we are going through the sixth mass extinction event. And what it means that even in the worst case scenario, because of this climate crisis, if civilization collapses and whatever happens, 8 billion people will not disappear. It's unlikely that the whole uh, civilization is going to disappear, but there's going to be a lot of suffering. So that is something that needs to be noted. And we've been around for 300,000 years. Modern civilization, the key component for the flourishing of modern civilization was predictable weather, and this was because of predictable temperature that we had that allowed us to flourish. So the state of the planet right now, we have data now for the last 800,000 years, and this is something that is widely available. I got this data from EPA, a government website in the United States, but this is widely available and agreed upon by the scientific community. For the past 800,000 years, if you look at the concentration of carbon dioxide, which is one of the primary greenhouse gases, it, it was between 170 to 300. Right now, it's about 420 parts per million, which is the measure of how much carbon dioxide you have in the atmosphere. And because of that, it leads to global warming. But 420 is just carbon dioxide. And I was talking to Sir David King, who spoke at the GLYC Climate Summit last month, and I've had several conversations with him. And Sir David told me, 420 is misleading because 420 is just taking into account the carbon dioxide. If you take into account other greenhouse gases like methane and others, we have exceeded 500 parts per million. So what it means is 500 parts per million in 2022. That is the state of the planet, and we have not, and we have no intelligence on how to navigate this, how to manage this, because we have not experienced this before. So that is where we are in terms of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. At COP27, I had a lot of conversations. So in three parts. One is I spent a lot of time in the cytosphere pavilion talking to climate scientists. So I had conversations with climate scientists. I had conversations at the country pavilions because the Global Youth Leadership Center, an organization that we have just launched, is going to have youth programming in different countries in East Africa and West Africa. So we had conversations at the country pavilions, and I also had a lot of conversations at the food pavilion, trying to understand about food security and the future of how young people can play a role in terms of entrepreneurial initiatives to tackle some of this. In the cytosphere pavilion, I was talking to young scientists who are presenting all this data, and these are photos that I took from the pavilion. Okay, so the ice sheets in Greenland, they are melting at a very fast rate, and we are rapidly losing ice. And what's happening because of that is, one is it's going to lead to sea level increase. The other thing that's going to happen is a large amounts of methane is going to be emitted from the permafrost. So that is something that is happening in the Arctics, and that's very alarming. And how we can reverse that, people are thinking about it, but that is going to accelerate the global warming in the next 10 to 20 years because of what's going on in the Arctics. And I asked, and as someone who's from Bangladesh, I was curious to know. So I asked the scientist from Cambridge University, who was also a scientist from Cambridge, and I asked him that, a country like Bangladesh, if we suffer from sea level increase, what percentage of the water in Bangladesh is going to come from mountain glacier melting, and what percentage of water is going to come because of the Arctic? So I was just curious to know, and he gave me some data. And if you look at, this is the photo I took about the Himalayas. If you look at the Himalayas, between 2000 and 2100, okay, by end of the century, even if we have very low emissions, 50% of the mountain glaciers are gone in the Himalayas, even in the best case scenario. And in the worst case scenario, it's going to happen much more quickly. And 1/3 of the water in a country like Bangladesh is going to come from the mountain glacier melting in Himalayas, and 2/3 is going to come from the Arctics and other places. And a three-level increase in water, three-level increase, which is very much possible in the coming days. What Bangladesh would look like, they also had a map at the pavilion, and I took a photo of this. This map is available on climatecentral.org. So this is what the country could look like in the coming decades. So This is where we are at right now. Now, the other thing Sir David King, he very specifically mentioned to me, is if you have heard in events that we are now at 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial level, then people who are quoting that number, they're quoting the average between 2010 and 2020. So that is the average increase in the 10 years. But in 2022, right now, we are at 1.35 degrees of global warming. So that is already above the pre-industrial level. So we are at 1.35. And if you recall the Paris Agreement, the goal of Paris Agreement was to limit it to 1.5, well, to 2, preferably 1.5, and we are going to exceed it. We are likely to exceed it at the current level of emission by 2030. So this is where we are at right now. Now, the COP is a gathering of countries around the world. They meet to discuss, to negotiate, to agree on certain standards, emission goals, and to track progress of where we are. We can trace back the development of the UNFCCC in 1992 in Rio. And then in 1997, really the Kyoto Protocol marked the first commitment of countries to reduce greenhouse emissions. Between 1997, it took us till 2015 to have the Paris Agreement, where all the signing parties, 197 countries, signed, and they said that they're going to limit global warming to below 2 degrees and preferably below 1.5 degrees. So that was 2015. The promise we made in 2015, we have not been able to be on track of that promise we made in 2015. And in 2022, in between, we had a COP in 2016 in Morocco, and then in 2021, we had the Glasgow Pact. And the challenge that in my point of view, is we are making all these commitments that we will reduce emissions, and we are reporting every year, but we're not taking enough action, and we're not doing enough to reduce our emissions. And in 2022, I was surprised to see that more than 600 people from the fossil fuel industry, they attended as delegates, right? So there's a big fossil fuel industry, and there is a business, there is an economics connected to it, but the reality is what is under the ground needs to be under the ground. That is what is needed for to get us out of this climate crisis. But that hasn't happened. One positive in the 2022 COP was there was an agreement among countries about the loss and damage, which is about compensating countries like Bangladesh and other developing countries who are suffering because of this climate crisis. But there's a lot more that needs to be done. But everyone is looking at it as a move in the positive direction. That at least we had an agreement, an acknowledgement that there has to be some sort of compensation, loss and damage funding for developing countries. And then in 2023, we will have COP28, and what we from the Global Youth Leadership Center, in our very small capacity, what we want to advocate for, you reduce fossil fuel delegates at COPs, you have more young people engaged there, because it's the future of the young generation. They need to have their voices heard. They need to be at the negotiating table and have greater opportunity for young people to engage. And what needs to happen is there has to be better accountability frameworks. So people are making pledges, and what is the accountability system? That how do you hold people accountable? How do you hold countries accountable? How do you hold corporations accountable? That you're committing to reducing your emissions, but how much are you actually on track? So the gaps in COP27, this is a slide that I took from BCG's Executive Perspectives, and they have produced a report highlighting where we are in terms of COP27 development. In terms of mitigation, the pledges and policies at COP27 are falling short of the Paris Agreement goals, and if we pursue the existing policies, we are on track to having a 2.6 to 2.8 degree Celsius warming, according to this report. Also, in terms of adaptation, most of the funding is going towards mitigation, and BCG in this report, they are advocating for greater funding for adaptation and loss and damage. although it's a move in the positive direction, a lot more needs to be done because the developing countries will require larger amount of funding to cope with the loss due to the climate challenge. Finance needs to grow, and one important thing is we need better measurement, reporting, and verification. So right now, all companies, those of us who work in private sector organizations or non-profit organizations, we need to get our accounts audited every year by a good audit firm, and we provide our audited financial statements at the back of our annual report. And in the future, every company should produce their audited carbon footprint statement, that this is what you said, this was your environmental footprint, and these are the actions that you're taking. So better measurement, reporting, and verification. Unless we can measure something, unless we can quantify it, it would be very difficult to take action to limit global warming. So in summary, where we are emissions, according to the latest conversations, the progress that we have made are still set to rise 11% by 2030, whereas what we need to happen is to reduce them by 45%. So this is what is the current state of the crisis, that all the parties, all the countries met at COP27 to come to an agreement that we are going to reduce our emissions. But the current policies that we have, instead of reducing emissions, we are still on track to increasing our emissions by 11%. And it's important when we think about emissions to have an understanding of where the emissions are coming from. So this is a slide I took from Bill Gates' book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. He provides a good analysis of where the emissions are coming from. So we are making things, cement, steel, plastic, 31% of our emissions are coming from there. From electricity, plugging in, 27%, growing things, plants and animals, 19%, getting around, planes, trucks, cargo ships, 16%, and keeping warm and cool, heating, cooling, refrigeration, 7%. So, so you look at this chart, and if you spend a minute thinking, all right, so we've got this global problem, how are we going to reduce our emissions? Okay. Given that the developed world, they're in one place, the developing world, they're in another place. Most of the developing world is in pursuit of economic growth because they want to, enjoy the lifestyle that people in the West enjoy, and there's nothing wrong in that. But all of this means that we have more consumption. So more consumption, 8 billion people. How are we going to reduce our emissions in this environment? And that's the difficulty that humanity collectively is facing. And there are two ways of doing this, and both are very difficult and unpopular things. And that's why we don't talk about it, because when we say unpopular things, well, politicians cannot say unpopular things, they would lose support. We also avoid saying unpopular things because then we will become unpopular, and we want to be liked. We want to say things that are, that sound good. But the reality is, we have to reduce our consumption. And the other reality is 8 billion people is a little too many people on this planet. And the current resources of the planet, with the current consumption level and the consumption that's going to happen over the next 20, 30 years as our incomes go up, the planet just cannot sustain this. So Peter Fikowski is also a friend, and he's a California-based scientist. And he wrote a book on climate restoration for humanity flourishing. And in that book, Peter argues that out of all the tools that we have, one powerful tool is in controlling the population. Now, population is something that I heard zero conversation at COP27 because it's just not the politically right thing to talk about, But if you look at the population growth, the UN projection of total fertility rate of 2. So the UN projects that population globally is going to stabilize at 10 billion people. So that is the UN projection. By 2100, the population will stabilize at 10 billion people. Now, Peter Fikowski, he worked at NASA before. He's used to dealing with large data sets, and he has put together this data that if we have imagine a scenario where we have a total fertility rate of 1, then by end of the century, the human population can come down to 2 billion people, which is a lot more manageable given the consumption pattern that we have, to reducing our carbon footprint. So 2 billion with a total fertility rate of 1. If we have a total fertility rate of 1.3, then by 2150, we come down to 2 billion. And if we have a total fertility rate of 1.5, then by 2200, which is around 180 years from now, roughly, we have a population of 2 billion. And some scientists argue, again, this is one point of view, that we have this planet, there are finite resources, we can cooperate with nature and bring down the population to 2 billion, or we don't cooperate with nature, we keep on doing, exploiting nature, pursue growth without any consideration for the environment. We continue on the current trajectory, and nature will figure out a way to bring us down to 2 billion and stabilize us there. So that's one argument that is there. But the point I'm trying to make is, you may agree to this point of view, you may not agree to this point of view, but there needs to be an acknowledgement that 8 billion people with the current lifestyle and the consumption pattern on this planet is just not sustainable. The planet cannot sustain this level of consumption. So that's the one conversation that I felt was missing at COP27. Two conversations. One was there was no conversation about consumption. Everyone was talking about change the world, all this technological progress, but the current level of consumption is also not sustainable. So there was no conversation around consumption because it's a difficult thing to do. No one wants to talk about it. And the other one was around population. So the nature of the climate crisis in terms of some numbers is we have excess 1 trillion tons of greenhouse gases up in the atmosphere. This has gone up since the 1750s, the Industrial Revolution. That needs to be removed, because even if our emission is zero today, what we have up there is sufficient for many countries to go underwater. So that needs to be removed. We emit about 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases every year. That needs to be lowered. And countries will have to adapt to extreme weather events. So these are the three key challenges that we are facing right now. So when we think about leadership, what kind of leadership would be required to tackle a crisis like this? The first question that I have, and I've been thinking about, because this is something that I've been teaching for many of you who know me. I started the Bangladesh Youth Leadership Center 14 years ago, and I've been working with young people teaching adaptive leadership. Is when people know that something is going to lead to a bad outcome, why cannot people change? So the idea is people are not resistant really to change. People are resistant to loss. Because if it's a positive change, and if I said to Sabbir here, Sabbir, I'm going to give you $1 million, that's a change in his life. He would not resist the $1 million. That's a good change. But if I told him, Sabbir, you have to give up something, you need to quit eating this, or changing your behavior, or just be happy with two shirts for the next 2 years, he would resist that, because that represents a loss in his life. And what people are really resisting in this climate conversation is a feeling of loss and a feeling of pain. And humans would go to great extent to avoid pain. And there is no win-win solution in this climate crisis. So that is one reason why people are avoiding change. Political leaders who are representing us at the highest level of authority and at these global forums, they look for authorization. We elect politicians to solve our problems. We don't elect politicians to give us bad news. And when politicians believe they have bad news, they just don't give us any news. It's, imagine you go to you go to a doctor and you spend so much money and you expect the doctor to solve your problem. The doctor is going to have a bypass operation, but if the doctor tells you change your diet, start walking, and gives you work, you'll be complaining. You'll be thinking, I'm paying you money to solve my problem. Why are you giving me the work back? But that is what needs to happen. Citizens have to take ownership of the work. And that's why political leaders are resistant. They are fully aware. The data that I showed you, they're fully aware of this data. They know what's coming, yet they don't take action. One is they want to pass on the problem to the next generation. They are incentivized to think short term. They care about elections, and rightly so. So I also, I'm not criticizing political leadership. I'm empathizing, and I'm just stating what the current reality is, which means that we cannot be depending on political leaders to solve this crisis. What needs to happen is we need to have collective leadership at all levels in society. And that collective leadership needs to have the capacity to help people face the difficult reality. Sometimes leaders mislead people by showing a false picture. But 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 we need the right kind of leadership in society that helps people grapple with this difficult reality that things are not so great. We have grown up thinking and learning that we are living in an age of abundance. You can keep on spending money, you can keep on growing the economy, you can just keep on growing at any cost. But that is just not what is sustainable. So so that's the kind of leadership that needs to happen at all levels in society, which is very difficult. Um, but that is what I think uh, is needed. And GYLC, the Global Youth Leadership Center, in a small capacity, that is what we want to promote. We work with young people. We support entrepreneurs in Bangladesh, and we want to support entrepreneurs internationally. And when we are working with entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship is all about growth. But the world doesn't have a growth problem. In 2022, the net wealth of the world is $500 trillion. That's the net wealth, highest at any moment in human history. If you divide that by 8 billion people, you have more than $62,000 per person. So we don't have a wealth problem in the world, we have a distribution problem. But we don't want to have that conversation because people who have wealth, we want to have more wealth. So that's why we are always talking about growth. And when we are talking about growth, we are not taking into consideration the environment, the well being of ecosystems. So that's the challenge that we are facing. Now, can you change human behavior and just, you change human behavior overnight? That's also not going to happen. But what we can do is we can have policies, we can ensure that businesses, initiatives, ventures take into account the well-being of ecosystems when we are allocating resources. I think that is something that needs to needs to happen. And in terms of what we see as essential work that needs to happen is, the first step is educating young people because it's their future, and and they are likely to take more ownership of this problem. So we educate young people about the science of climate change. So when young people have better information, they can take better decisions. We don't have to preach, but we have to give them the right kind of education. I think this is where uh, we we went wrong. At least in my education, I went to good universities in the UK and America, but there was no teaching about environmental consideration, consumption, ecosystems. I received no education about it. I grew up learning maximize shareholder value, maximize wealth. There are abundant resources in the world, which is not true. So we need to provide the right kind of education to the young generation and make them aware about climate science, give them the leadership skills so that they can mobilize themselves and they can mobilize others. This is what needs to happen. And we also need responsible entrepreneurship. We cannot, of course, we have to pursue growth. We have to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities, particularly in global south, where large number of young people are struggling for livelihood. But that entrepreneurship needs to be more along the lines of social entrepreneurship, that you're not just in it for maximizing profit, but you're looking after the well-being of ecosystems, and you're committed to the public good. So that's the summary of what I've told you. I want to spend the last 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes with comments from the audience. And if you have any questions, but the summary of what I've said is we don't have any time to waste. The next 10 years are critical for the future of humanity and for our collective well-being. So all of us have a role to play here. And that's why I wanted to share my thoughts with you. At least if I can encourage you, if this presentation encourages you to learn a bit more and take some action, then it will have served its purpose. The planet cannot just sustain the current level of consumption that we have. And often when we are talking about solutions, we talk about technical solutions. Technology is going to get us out of this problem. Technology is going to play a big part, but unless you and I change our behavior, nothing's going to change. It's not these two are not mutually exclusive. We need technological innovation, we need technological progress, but we also need to change our behavior, and we have to take ownership of our behavior. Unless we change ourselves, nothing will change. So that's the summary of today's talk, and I'm open to hearing your thoughts, reflections, questions. Thank you.
So if anybody wants to speak, please raise your hand, then we will unmute yourself to speak. I can see Rokon here raised his hand. So yeah, Rokon, please go ahead.
Hello everyone. So it's just a amazing discussion. I just wanted to know that the COP27 have assured us that the fund on loss and damage to provide financial assistance to nations that are most vulnerable and impacted, I should say, effects of climate change. I just wanted to know your observation that what do you think would be the first step and the success that would depend on the loss and damage fund? And do you think that this fund would get off quickly off the ground right after COP27?
Thank you. Let's take a few more comments.
Anyone else would like to speak? Please raise your hand, then we will.
Gagan from India wanted to say something.
Hi, Gagan. Please go ahead.
Am I audible? Hello.
Yes.
Very good evening to all of you. I am Gagan from Punjab. I really appreciate the work, and personally,
Gagan, we can't hear your voice. Are you there? Gagan, are you there? Please unmute yourself. he is facing some technical difficulties. So anyone else would like to go next? Oh, Gagan is having network issues. So Gagan, you can also write your questions on the chat box. So we'll then pick it from there. Anyone else would like to ask questions? I can see Kaushik raise his hand. Hi Kaushik, please go ahead with your question.
Good evening, all. Yesterday I heard that Bangladesh will receive $1 million. For my observation, in the past time, in Bangladesh, there is a lot of unequal distribution of the climate uh, fund. The political leader, they distributed money in here and there, and it doesn't actually work. So now, for my question is, how do you think the political leader distributed this money equally to the most vulnerable people? And are they, when they plan, are they talking with this matter with the researcher, and which area is most affected and which people are most affected? Because we see when they talk in the COP and other sector, they louder their voice and they identify the problem in significant way. But when they come in the ground, when they start working in ground, we found that they don't work the correct way. They don't distribute money inequally. We need a strong cyclone shelter. We need a strong embankment. So that time we found that they don't make the proper way. So this is my question. Thank you.
We take a few more questions.
Please raise your hand so we can let you to unmute yourself. Yeah. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
This is Yahya Nokib from Dhaka. I have a question. I'm hearing about loss and damage fund loudly in our country, but the emission control or the 1.5-degree pledge are missing there. So how we can judge this COP27? How can we judge what kind of success we get from this COP? How we explain it?
Thank you. Maybe I can just respond these three questions quickly, and then if you have time, take a few more. So a lot of comments on loss and damage. I think loss and damage and emission, there is a lack of trust between the global north and the south. The south's position is the north they've enjoyed the growth. They've had, the fossil fuel growth, and now it's on us to pay the price. So there has to be loss and damage, and unless there is loss and damage, we're not going to pay attention on emission. So there is lack of trust between the north and the south, and I think one achievement of COP27 was the progress we made on loss and damage. This is not a new conversation. This has been going on since COP29, and the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage was created at COP19, and then at COP21 we made some progress. At COP25 we made some progress. At COP26 we also spoke about it, and then at COP27 we have finally agreed to loss and damage. But there are still a lot of outstanding questions on loss and damage. The sources of funding, which countries will pay into the fund, the recipients of funding, which may prompt discussion on the definition of development, and most importantly, the quantum of funding. The agreement this year at COP27 was countries only pledged 350 million, which is 0.01% of costs already incurred from climate disasters. So the quantum of funding is critical when you're talking about this loss and damage. Now, many of the participants here are from Bangladesh, and I know this is This is a big issue for a country like Bangladesh, because we are experiencing this loss, and we need funds to sort of cope with this reality. And to respond to the question on how this fund is going to be allocated internally, I don't have knowledge on how the political system you know would navigate this, but there has to be systems in place of checks and balances and accountability. So people who deserve the funding on the grassroots, they actually get the funding. That is something that needs to happen. But from the Global Youth Leadership Center, what we are concerned about is 1/3 of the focus has to be on adaptation, mitigation, and then 1/3 has to be on restoration. You have to remove the excess greenhouse gases. So many of you in this room, when you're thinking about businesses, you have to think about, I think the only, business is about solving a problem. And when a young person coming out of university is thinking about the business, the question you should be asking is, what's the problem I want to solve? And the problem, I think, has to be connected to the climate crisis, because this is the biggest challenge of our lifetime. Are you building a business that somehow contributes to CO2 removal? Are you building a business that is reducing our emission? Or are you building a business that is helping us adapt to the changing realities? And there will be a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities in this space for young people to explore. And you will also be able to generate profit if you can build a business in this sector. Okay, I hope that gave some clarity to your questions. We have a couple of minutes left. Any closing comments from anyone in the audience?
I can see Ignace Pasu has raised his hand. So Ignace, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Is Inyas Passau from West Africa. I want you to talk more about greenhouse gases emission, because every country is just adapting how to reduce it. And then I heard you talking about factories, how they will reduce it through, I don't know how to sort it out. How will they manage to reduce for the factories? I hope you get me.
Yeah, where in West Africa are you from?
From Senegal.
Okay. Wonderful. And your question was around emissions?
Yes, about greenhouse gases footprint.
So, yeah, so I think, young people in West Africa, and I was in Nigeria recently talking to young people, organizations working with young people. I think to begin that conversation around emissions, that young people have a role to play. And often in our part of the world, in the global south, climate change is seen as tomorrow's problem. Today's problem is livelihood, growth. So you do whatever you need to do at the expense of the environment to make progress. I think that idea needs to be challenged. And young people have a big role to play here. That yes, you need growth, you need livelihood, but not at the expense of environmental degradation. You have to look after the well-being of all ecosystems, and then build a system where you can have a livelihood. And if we can have more conversations around it, raise more awareness about it, then businesses will pay attention, and eventually society will move in the right direction. And if your question was about where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, you can write to me separately. I can provide you data on, well, I have aggregate data globally where the emissions are coming from, but I'm sure there are also data available for West Africa.
Anyone would like to give a closing remark? What you have just heard, any reflection? Please raise your hand. I can see Shohan Bhai here, raise his hand. Shohan Bhai, please go ahead. Rahat, we'll come back later.
Yeah, can you hear me, Rafiq Bhai?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. In COP27, loss and damage is a new breakthrough after 30 years fight, but still we are not confirmed that when we'll get the bill. And the global shield is not a proper mechanism, and the doubling funding to adaptation is not getting the climate vulnerable countries. And a new breakthrough for COP, it's the young people. So first time young people recognized as a non-stakeholder is the part of the action for communities as well as the youth pavilion. But we missed the mitigation. And some economic low emission like oil and gas included there, and like 600 fossil fuel lobbyists attended there. So we are not heading to truly solving the climate crisis. Uh, so just loss and damage or adaptation funding is not enough to tackle the climate crisis. So my specific questions or my thought with Ezaz Bhai, what is our takeaways from the COP27? Uh, it's not our individual as well as the GOLC to run up COP28, and we know the solution will not come from the COP27. So what kind of action we can take collectively right now? Thank you. Over to you, Rohik bhai.
So I can also see Rahat Ullah Tosif. So Rahat, please quickly ask your share your feedback.
Thank you, sir. I am Tosi from University of Dhaka. We some students are making a curriculum for a school level student here in Bangladesh. We want to decorate curriculum in introducing environmental problems and solutions which are applicable in the society. My question is how a school going student collectively take part to mitigate or adapt environmental damages, or in which part we should emphasize while making a curriculum for a school going student about climate. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time, so I'll briefly respond to the two questions. First of all, when you're talking about the school curriculum, just educating young people about climate science, where emissions are coming from. How is your diet contributing to carbon emissions? Where is methane coming from? Why is methane a problem? Why is CO2 a problem? The basic science of climate change, I think there needs to be greater awareness among young people. When young people are aware, they'll figure out themselves where the opportunities are. If it's for activism, not everyone's going to become an activist. Some people will become entrepreneurs, some people will become job seeker. But the climate, the flourishing of humanity has to be at the center of everything that we do. So I think that orientation, that awareness needs to start, and school is a great age, and all of you have a role to play there. So that's number one. And second, to respond to Shohan's comment, Shohan was also a GLYC delegate with me at COP27. He represented the youth of Global South there and did a great job highlighting concerns of young people. And I think, again, young people will have to put pressure on our governments, on businesses to focus on mitigation. This is a hard problem because, as I told you, human behavior is we avoid pain, we don't like loss, we are short-sighted. Now you're going against the grain, you're going against the nature of human behavior to bring about this change. So therefore there has to be lot of work, lot of advocacy, lot of campaigning, lot of pressure on businesses and governments to take mitigation seriously. And what needs to happen at COP28 and at national level and at global level is holding people accountable for what they are saying. If people in the world, everyone did what they said, the world would be a different place. People say what they don't mean, and people don't mean what they say. So if people are giving all these big speeches at events like COP that we are going to reduce our emissions, but their actions are different. So how can we bridge the gap between what we are saying and what we are doing? And young people have a big role to play there because you are also going to be the future job seekers. You will be the future professionals who will be driving companies. If you go and talk to your company that where is your audit report for your carbon emission, this is, you said you would reduce your emission by X% by 2 years, what is the progress? and then the nationally determined the emissions, the NDCs, that countries are making pledges, but how far are you moving? Right now, what's happening is every country is thinking, let me just burn a bit more fossil fuel, get ahead a bit, and they'll think about climate change later on in the future. We've just been deferring our progress to the future, and that's why we are in this crisis. That's every political leader who is at the COP events, that's how they're thinking. I've got a domestic constituency to look after. I've got national interests. I've got elections coming up. I need to look after my people. Let me just move a bit further ahead in the growth curve, and then I will think about it. And that thinking has led us to where we are today. And we need new thinking, we need fresh thinking, and we need this mobilization, pressure, activism, campaigning from young people to bring that change. And that's why we are looking to you to